The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of my library, illuminating the leather bindings of the books and creating fanciful patterns on the Persian rug. I leisurely flipped through the pages of Churchill's biography, occasionally sipping coffee from a china cup. At 72, I had retained the clarity of mind and grit that had once helped me build a successful medical device business. Now, 2 years after the death of my wife, Jennifer, I have learned to appreciate the peace and quiet of my mansion. The house in Willow Heights, an upscale neighborhood in Midwest City, was my pride. The two-story Victorian mansion with turrets and carved details occupied a quarter-acre lot. I'd personally overseen every detail of the restoration when I'd bought the house 30 years ago. Jennifer joked at the time that I fell in love with the house more than I fell in love with her. Perhaps there was some truth to that. Every room held our shared memories, every piece carefully chosen and put in its place. The mahogany study overlooking the garden, where I had once signed the most important contracts. A dining room with a crystal chandelier where we hosted business associates and close friends. The living room with a fireplace where we spent winter evenings reading books and listening to jazz. Every corner breathed the story of our family, the story of the success I had built over decades. After selling the business 5 years ago, I could afford a quiet life. A pension plus investment income gave me complete financial independence. I read, tended the garden, and occasionally met up with my remaining friends at the golf club. Most of my peers had either moved on to warmer states or passed away. The loneliness didn't weigh on me. I'd never been an overly social person. The sound of car doors made me raise my eyes from my book. Through the window, I watched my son Rob get out of a silver midsize sedan, followed by his wife Heather. Sunday lunches had become a tradition since Jennifer's death, though I wasn't sure the tradition brought me joy. Rob, a 40-year-old manager at an insurance company, looked tired and stressed. He didn't particularly enjoy his job, the pay was average, and his wife's ambitions far exceeded his financial means. I often thought about where I had gone wrong in raising my son. Rob hadn't inherited my business acumen or ambition. He was average at school, barely made it through university with a degree in business administration, and made do with what he had. Maybe I was overprotecting him from hardship, maybe I was giving him everything he needed. Jennifer was always defending her son, saying that not everyone should be a fighter. But I knew that only those who were willing to fight could survive in this world. Heather, as always, was dressed a little too brightly for a family dinner. A red dress by some mid-sized designer, high heels, massive jewelry, all of it screamed of a desire to impress. At 35, she was still attractive, but her face had already taken on the hard features of a woman dissatisfied with her position in life. I remembered how she'd once worked as a secretary in Rob's office, and how she'd actively hunted for a suitor with prospects. Rob, soft in personality and lonely after a failed first marriage, was the perfect target. She knew how to be charming when needed. In the first few months of meeting the family, Heather was the epitome of modesty and domesticity. She made Rob lunches, took an interest in his work, and spoke respectfully of his parents. Jennifer even rejoiced that her son had finally found the right girl. I was more skeptical, but kept my opinion to myself. My son was entitled to his own mistakes. Heather's true colors revealed themselves gradually. First, there were hints that Rob could earn more. Then the comparisons with her friends' husbands began. Who worked where, who got how much, who bought what kind of car. Rob tried to please, took on extra work, went into debt, but it was never enough. Dolores, the housekeeper, was already setting the table in the dining room, arranging the best plates and silverware. I insisted that Sunday dinners be ceremonial. It was one of the few traditions I wasn't going to change. The smell of roast beef wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the scent of fresh roses from my garden. Dolores had worked for us for 8 years under Jennifer and knew all my habits. She was one of the few people I could talk frankly with. Maybe because she didn't expect anything more than an honest paycheck from me. "Hi, Dad." Rob hugged me, a little tentatively as always. There was a sense of obligation in his embrace, as if he was doing an unpleasant duty. In recent years, we'd become strangers. Not hostile, just strangers. We had no common interests, no shared memories we wanted to recall. Heather put her cheek up for a kiss, exuding the suffocating scent of expensive perfume. I noticed that she always bought perfume more expensive than she could afford. It was one way to maintain the illusion of status. How are you doing, Michael? She never called me father, which was fine with me, though. Fine, thank you. Come on in. Dolores has everything ready. We were seated at the long oak table. I took the chair at the head. It had been mine for 30 years, and I wasn't about to change it. Rob and Heather sat across from each other. The conversation was slow at first, discussing the weather, the news, Rob's work. Heather talked about her friends and their successes, not forgetting to emphasize that Sandra had recently moved into a $300,000 house, and Michelle's husband had bought a new Lexus. I listened to this familiar set of stories about other people's successes and realized that each story was a jab to Rob's ego and a hint to me. Heather never spoke directly, but she knew how to create the right atmosphere. Rob would blush, fidget in his chair, explain in an apologetic tone why they couldn't afford this or that yet. And Patricia says their house went up 100 grand in price in the last year. Heather cut off a piece of meat as if delivering a punch. Real estate in good neighborhoods only goes up in value. A very worthwhile investment. I nodded, continuing to eat. I'd long ago realized where this kind of talk was leading. Heather never spoke directly, but her hints were becoming less and less veiled. Houses, neighborhoods, prices, all of these were not casual topics of conversation. She wasn't studying the real estate market out of academic interest. Rob looked uncomfortable, occasionally casting warning glances at his wife. He knew me well enough to realize I wasn't the kind of person who could be coerced into doing something against their will. But Heather was persistent. By the way, Michael, have you thought about, well, simplifying your life? The house is so big, it's probably a lot of hassle to clean. Garden. And the stairs. At your age, that might not be safe. I have Dolores for cleaning and a gardener for the allotment, I replied calmly. And I climb stairs without difficulty. Of course, of course. It's just that, some people your age prefer to move somewhere where they're cared for, where there's a community of peers. Bob from our office recently took his mother to a great place. There's medical care, entertainment, and new acquaintances. Rob choked on his wine and started coughing. Heather, his voice sounded warning, but weak. What? I'm just thinking about your father's comfort. Specialized senior communities have such facilities now. Spas, restaurants, recreational programs, libraries. People don't feel lonely there. I set my fork aside and looked at my sister-in-law carefully. In her eyes, I read what I wanted to see. Poorly concealed greed and impatience. She was already mentally rearranging the furniture in my house, already planning how she would receive guests in my living room, perhaps even choosing which walls to tear down for remodeling. I'm quite happy with my life here, I said quietly, but there was a steel in my voice that Rob remembered well from his childhood. Heather realized she'd gone too far and quickly changed the subject to a safe one, talking about a new show she was watching in the evenings. But it was too late. The cards had been dealt, and we all realized it. The rest of lunch passed in tense silence. Heather feigned excitement as she talked about her vacation plans, her new diet, her problems with her roommate. Rob nodded and apologized with a look, and I reflected on how quickly people show their true colors when it comes to money. Even bloodlines don't stop when a big inheritance looms on the horizon. When the guests finally left, the mansion fell back into its usual silence. I stood at the library window, watching their car disappear around the corner. The sun was setting, coloring the garden with golden hues. Jennifer loved this time of day. We often sat on the terrace drinking wine and planning the future. Now the future seemed much less certain. I realized that today's conversation was just the beginning, that Heather wouldn't stop at hints. She would proceed methodically, working Rob, building pressure, looking for allies. Maybe bring in a doctor to tell me I needed constant care. Maybe start spreading rumors that I'm becoming forgetful or inadequate. And I wasn't wrong. The following weeks brought what I expected. Heather didn't wait. She began to act with her usual methodical nature. At first, the calls became more frequent. Rob called in the evenings, inquiring about my health, asking if I needed help around the house. There was an insincerity in his voice. He was doing his wife's job, but he was doing it ineptly. "Dad, how are you doing? You don't have a cold?" The call Wednesday night caught me reading in the study. "Everything's fine, Rob. How are you doing at work?" "Yeah, fine. Listen, Are you sure you're handling everything? The house is big, it must be hard to keep track of everything. I listened in silence to these clumsy attempts to probe. Rob had never been a good actor. His concern for my health sounded like a memorized speech. Rob, if you have something specific you want to talk about, be direct. No, it's just, Heather says I should be more interested in your business. There it is. Heather gives instructions and Rob obediently follows them. I cut the conversation short under the pretense of fatigue, but realized this was just the beginning of the campaign. Then the chance encounters began. Heather showed up at the grocery store where I usually bought my groceries, at the drugstore, at the park where I took my morning walk. Each encounter was accompanied by caring questions about my health and innocent remarks about how hard it must be to keep such a big house in order. Michael, what a surprise! Heather materialized next to the meat counter at the supermarket where I was picking out a steak for dinner. She was wearing a sports dress and sneakers. Apparently, she was picturing a casual jog. Heather, I nodded, continuing to study the meat. How are you doing? Rob said you were complaining about insomnia last night. I hadn't complained about insomnia. I'd mentioned that I'd been reading late. But Heather was already starting to creatively interpret the facts. It could be a sign of stress. At your age, your body reacts differently to stress, and running a large household is a serious strain. My household is perfectly fine. Sure, it's just that, there are specialists who help people make difficult decisions about life changes. Gerontologists, social workers. They can assess what's really best for a person in the long run. I took the steak and headed for the register. Heather walked beside me, continuing her caring chatter about the benefits of living in specialized senior living communities. She had clearly researched the issue, naming specific names, mentioning statistics, talking about acquaintances who were so happy after moving in. There's also so much social activity there. People play cards, go to dances, participate in art circles. Much more fun than sitting at home alone. I paid for my purchases and walked out without saying a word. But Heather had accomplished her goal. She had publicly stated her position. Anyone who heard our conversation might have thought the caring daughter-in-law was worried about the lonely father-in-law. Rob, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly nervous. At the next Sunday lunch, he looked exhausted. He had obviously been subjected to intense treatment at home. Heather was on a roll, talking about new discoveries in elder care. Can you believe this, Michael? I read an article about how people after 70 often overestimate their capabilities. It's called cognitive distortion. The person doesn't notice their abilities declining because the changes are gradual. Rob fidgeted in his chair, clearly realizing his wife was overstepping her bounds. Heather, Dad looks fine, he tried to object weakly. Sure, outwardly everything is fine, but there are hidden signs, aren't there? For example, forgetfulness, decreased motor coordination, difficulty making decisions. I don't have any memory or coordination problems, I said coldly. Well, you won't notice it yourself. That's the main problem. The person doesn't realize the changes. That's why it's so important to have loved ones take responsibility for making difficult decisions. She spoke as if I was already an incapacitated old man in need of care. Rob blushed but kept quiet. At home, he'd apparently been indoctrinated that resisting his daughter-in-law was tantamount to betraying his father. After lunch, when Heather excused herself to the bathroom, Rob tried to apologize. Dad, don't mind Heather. She's just worried. Her grandmother recently had a fall at home and broke her hip, and now Heather sees danger everywhere. Lies. Heather had never had a close relationship with her grandmother. She hadn't even gone to the funeral 2 years ago. But Rob was desperate to find an excuse for his wife's behavior and to assuage his conscience. Rob, it's not my safety your wife is interested in. What are you talking about? You know exactly what you're talking about. He looked away, not daring to object. Somewhere in the back of his mind he knew the truth, but to admit it meant admitting he was allowing his wife to take advantage of him. Heather's campaign was gaining momentum. She began to enlist allies, telling neighbors about her concerns about my health, asking them if they'd noticed any warning signs. Mrs. Collins from next door even stopped by one morning, ostensibly to get salt, but really to assess my condition with her own eyes. Michael, how are you doing? Heather was telling me that you've been, well, a little more tired than usual. Heather's wrong. Of course she is. It's just, at our age, it's so important to take an honest assessment of your strength. My late Harold also said until the last minute that he was handling everything on his own, and then he fell down the stairs. I realized this wasn't a casual conversation. Heather had begun to create a perception in the neighborhood that I needed looking after. But out of stubbornness, I refused to admit the obvious. She was particularly active in working Dr. Stevens, our family doctor. After a routine checkup, he held me up for a friendly chat. "Michael, your sister-in-law called me last week. She's concerned about you living alone in such a large house." "Dr. Stevens, have you found any health problems with me?" "No, physically you're in great shape for your age. But Heather has mentioned some episodes of forgetfulness, difficulty performing daily tasks." "What episodes?" The doctor looked into his notebook. "She said that you forgot to turn off the gas on the stove, that you confused people's names, that you became more withdrawn and irritable." Each accusation was a lie, but stated in medical terms, they sounded convincing. Heather was smarter than I thought. She wasn't just out to get my house. She was paving the way for me to be declared incompetent. "Doctor, none of these claims are true. I've never forgotten to turn off the gas. I remember names perfectly, and I haven't become more irritable than usual." "I see, I understand. But sometimes family members notice changes before the patient himself. Perhaps we should consider a more supportive living situation." I stood up and headed for the door. "Dr. Stevens, if you have a medical reason to consider me incapacitated, file the appropriate paperwork. If not, don't participate in the family intrigue." At home, I sat in my office for a long time, contemplating the situation. Heather acted professionally, creating a documented history of my problems, bringing in witnesses, forming a medical opinion. Rob, meanwhile, was sinking deeper and deeper into the role of the caring son who had to make difficult decisions for the good of his father. During the next phone call, he was already speaking more confidently. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation on Sunday. Maybe Heather's right. Maybe you really should think about making a change." "What kind of change?" "Well, about moving to a place where you'll be cared for. I realize it's difficult, but you've always said yourself that you should make sensible decisions, not be driven by emotion." He was using my own words against me. It was undoubtedly Heather's technique. "Rob, what happens to the house if I move?" A long pause. "Well, the house will stay in the family. We'll maintain it, keep an eye on it, live in it." Another pause, even longer. "Perhaps it would be practical, not leaving the house empty, saving on rent." There it was, the true purpose of the whole campaign. Rob finally said out loud what he and Heather had been dreaming about for months. "My house, my 30 years of labor, should go to them simply because they feel entitled to it." "I see," I said calmly. After the conversation, I poured myself a whiskey and went out onto the terrace. The evening was warm. The roses I had planted with my own hands were blooming in the garden. Every tree, every flower bed had been created by me. And now my own son, the fruit of my blood, was planning to kick me out of my house to please his greedy wife. But I had one trait that neither Rob nor Heather took into account. I wasn't used to giving up without a fight. And if they wanted a war, they'd get one. I'd never considered myself a person prone to eavesdropping, but sometimes circumstances force us to overstep our own principles. That Thursday evening, I was working in the garden, trimming the rose bushes against the east wall of the house. The work required focus. Each cut had to be made at the right angle so that the plant could recover and produce new shoots. Jennifer had always said that gardening was a metaphor for life. Sometimes you have to cut something alive to give something better a chance to grow. The sound of a car made me raise my head. Rob hadn't arrived alone. Along with him, an older woman I recognized immediately got out of the car. Heather's mother, Dorothy Crane, didn't come to our house very often. A woman in her 60s, with carefully styled gray hair and a keen eye, she always gave me the impression of someone who was used to getting what she wanted by any means necessary. Heather had clearly inherited her mother's manipulative skills and unquenchable greed. I continued to work, pretending not to notice the guests. The rose bushes grew just below the living room window, and if someone was talking loud enough, the sounds traveled outside. I hadn't planned to eavesdrop. I was just in the right place at the right time. Dorothy entered the house with the look of a hostess, surveying the surroundings with an appraising eye. I saw her stop at every expensive object, a Chinese vase in the hallway, a gilt-frame painting, an antique mahogany dresser. Her eyes literally scanned the space, calculating the value of what she saw. "Where's Michael?" I heard her harsh voice. "In the garden, I suppose. He's always messing around there in the evenings," Rob replied. I could hear the tiredness in his voice. Apparently his mother-in-law's visit had not been his initiative. "Good. We need to talk without him." They made their way into the living room. I moved cautiously to the window, continuing to pretend I was absorbed in my work. The secateurs in my hands froze. I was afraid that even the slightest sound would give away my presence. "Robert, I came because Heather told me about your plans," Dorothy began without preamble. She always called her son by his full name, as if he were her subordinate rather than her son-in-law. "What plans?" Rob sounded wary. "Don't play dumb. About moving your father into a nursing home and what you're going to do with the house." A pause. I could hear Rob pacing the room, his footsteps creaking on the old hardwood floorboards. "We haven't decided anything definitively yet." "Nonsense. Heather says you've already started probing the ground. And you're doing the right thing. The old man won't live forever, and the house is too expensive to pass up." I was struck by the coldness with which this woman spoke of my death, as if I were not a person, but an obstacle in the way of a desirable goal. "Dorothy, Papa is still quite well. Healthy or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is that he lives alone in a house worth over $1 million. It's unreasonable and impractical." "But it's his house. He has a right to—" "Robert," Dorothy's voice grew harder, "you've always been too soft. That's why you're still working for an average salary at an insurance company instead of going into serious business. Life doesn't give gifts to those who don't know how to take them." I heard the sound of the door opening. Someone came into the living room. "Mom, it's so good of you to come." Heather's voice sounded falsely happy. "Hello, daughter. I was explaining to Robert that you have the right idea about this house." "Of course it's right. Michael at 72 can't adequately care for such a large household. And we're young. We have enough energy for the house and everything else." "Exactly. And the longer you procrastinate, the harder it will be to make a decision. Old people only get more stubborn with time." Rob paced the room again. I imagined his face. He always walked like that when he was nervous or couldn't make a decision. "But how are we going to do this? Dad won't agree willingly." "Who says we need his consent?" replied Dorothy sharply. "There are many ways to declare a person incapacitated, especially if there's medical evidence." "But Dad doesn't have a medical condition." "Robert, you're a naive fool." Annoyance sounded in her mother-in-law's voice. "Indications can be created. Heather has already talked to the doctor. The neighbors are starting to notice oddities in your father's behavior. We just need to follow through." "So you're suggesting I lie about my own father's condition?" "I'm suggesting you secure your family's future," Dorothy retorted. "Your wife deserves a better life than what you can offer her on your poverty wages. And this house could change everything." Heather took the floor, and in her voice I heard that honeyed tone she used when she wanted to convince someone. "Rob, honey, Mom's right. We're not doing anything wrong. We're just taking care of your dad. He'll be much better off in a good nursing home than here alone. And we'll be able to properly maintain this beautiful home." "And then what? We just move in here?" "Why not?" intervened Dorothy. "The house still has to go to someone after Michael dies. It's better to let it happen now, while you're still young and can enjoy it." "But—" "No buts, Robert. You're the sole heir. This house will be yours anyway, sooner or later. We're just hastening the inevitable." I gripped the pruning shears tighter in my hand. The inevitable. They spoke of my death as an inevitability that simply inconvenienced them with its slowness. "Imagine," Heather continued in a dreamy tone, "we'll be living here, hosting guests, throwing parties. We'll finally have a status to match our ambitions." "Yes, my father's house will soon be yours," Rob said quietly. Those words sounded like a sentence. My own son, the fruit of my hopes and labors. The man I'd raised, taught, maintained. This man was already mentally bearing me and dividing my property. "There you see how beautiful that sounds," laughed Dorothy. "Your father's house will soon be ours. And you'll finally start living like a man instead of a loser. When do we start acting? Asked Heather. As soon as possible, replied Dorothy. I know a good lawyer who specializes in cases like this, and Heather already has contacts with a doctor. All that's left is to gather statements from the neighbors and file the papers with the court. What if Dad resists? What can he do? An old, lonely man against a family that cares about his well-being? The court is always on the side of the relatives in such cases. I heard the sound of chairs being moved. Apparently they were sitting down to discuss the details of their plan. The key is to proceed carefully and consistently, Dorothy continued. No sudden moves, no fighting. You are caring relatives who are worried about an elderly person. All your actions are motivated solely by love and concern. What if he guesses? Asked Rob. What if he guesses? What's he going to do? Complain to the neighbors about his son wanting to put him in a nice nursing home. I mean, that's ridiculous. On the contrary, any objections he makes will be seen as senile stubbornness. Heather chuckled. Yeah, I imagine he'll be telling everyone we want to take the house away from him. Everyone will think he's senile paranoia. Exactly, her mother approved. The more he protests, the easier it will be to prove his inadequacy. I realized I'd heard enough. Stepping carefully away from the window, I headed toward the back of the garden where I couldn't be seen from the house. My heart was beating so loudly I was afraid. Its pounding would give away my presence. My hands shook with anger and shock. They were planning to steal my life. Not just a house, my whole life, my independence, my right to decide my own fate. And worst of all, they were doing it in good conscience, convincing themselves that they were acting out of noble motives. I sat down on a bench at the back of the garden and tried to calm down. I had to think rationally, not give in to emotion. I knew all too well how the system worked. If they went to court to declare me incompetent, if they had medical reports and testimony, I had little chance of defending my rights, especially since judges tend to trust caring relatives more than elderly people who can seem stubborn and unreasonable. But I had one advantage they didn't expect. I knew of their plans, and while they thought they were acting in secret, I could prepare my response. When they finally left half an hour later, I was still sitting in the garden. The sun was setting, coloring the sky with purple hues. It was beautiful and peaceful. Nothing reminded me of the chaos that was going on in my soul. Rob didn't even try to find me to say goodbye. Apparently, he was embarrassed to look me in the eye after his conversation with his mother-in-law. Or maybe he was just in a hurry to get home, to start putting his dastardly plan into action. In the evening, I sat in my study, drinking whiskey and thinking about what to do next. I could try to talk to Rob, explain to him that I knew everything. But that would be naive. He'd already made his choice between his father and his wife. I could go to a lawyer, prepare for a legal battle. But even if I won the case, my relationship with my son would be ruined forever. And if I lost, I'd lose everything. No, I needed something else. Something to make them realize the cost of betrayal. Something to show them that I was no joke. And slowly, a plan began to form in my head. I spent the first 3 days after the overheard conversation in a state of what might be called creative rage. Anger is a poor advisor for making decisions, but a great catalyst for finding out-of-the-box solutions. I stayed up nights thinking through various responses to the betrayal of my son and his wife. At first, I considered traditional means of revenge. I could change the will, disinheriting Rob in favor of a charitable organization. I could go public with their plans, embarrassing them in the eyes of friends and neighbors. I could even try to use their own weapons against them, collect dirt on Heather, or find ways to pressure Rob. But none of those options seemed graceful enough. They wanted my house? Fine. They thought they had the right to control my property? Fine. But revenge had to be more than just painful. It had to be instructive. Thursday morning, while sipping coffee in the library, I came across an article on the internet about an unusual construction business. A company in Texas specialized in moving historic buildings. They could take apart an old house brick by brick, move it to a new location, and reassemble it. Or, which I found much more interesting, they could lift the entire house and transport it on special platforms. The idea was so crazy that I dismissed it at first. But the more I thought about it, the more appealing it seemed. Rob and Heather wanted this particular house, this particular mansion with its carved details and history. What if we gave them what they asked for, but not exactly what they expected? I spent the afternoon researching information about building transportation. It turned out to be quite the industry. Historical societies regularly saved old houses from demolition by transporting them to open-air museums. Wealthy eccentrics sometimes bought buildings they liked and transported them to their lots. The technology was well honed, though it cost a lot of money. By Thursday evening, I was on the phone with the manager of Heritage Moving of Dallas. Jack Collins, a man with a Texas accent and 30 years of experience transporting buildings, listened to my request with professional calm. "Mr. Harrington, your house is perfectly capable of being moved. I can see from the photos that it's a good Victorian building, built to last. We've moved dozens of them before. And how difficult is it technically? For our team, it's a routine job. We lift the house with jacks, bring in the steel beams, load it onto the platforms and drive it. The main thing is to choose the right route and prepare the new location. How long will such an operation take? From preparation to completion, about 2 weeks. But that's if everything is ready in advance. Permits are obtained, communications are disconnected, the new site is prepared." The price was impressive, almost $200,000, but for a man of my wealth, it was quite affordable, especially considering that the result would be priceless. "Mr. Collins, can you recommend a specialist in our area? I'd like to meet someone in person." "Of course. We have a partner working in Midwest City Structural Relocation Services. Great guys, I've been working with them for about 15 years. On Friday, I met with a representative from a local company. Mark Wilson, a structural engineer in his 50s, arrived at my house wearing work clothes and carrying a lot of measuring equipment. For 2 hours, he surveyed the foundation, studied the construction of the walls, and took measurements. "The house is in excellent condition," he said at last. "The foundation is strong, the walls are holding up well. We can move it without any problems." "What about the process itself?" Mark pulled out a clipboard and showed me videos of previous jobs. "First, we disconnect all the utilities, gas, electricity, water. Then we raise the house with jacks. We do it gradually, literally an inch a day, so as not to damage the structure. When the house is raised high enough, we bring steel beams and install wheeled platforms. From there, it's a matter of engineering." "What about the interior furnishings, the furniture?" "If it's secured, it stays put. But I recommend you take out everything valuable and fragile in advance. Although our houses arrive in one piece, we drive at no more than 5 miles an hour." Mark quoted a price, $175,000 plus the cost of preparing the new lot and hooking up utilities. "And when could you start work?" "If you've decided on a new location and gotten all the permits, in 2 weeks. But first you need to select a site and prepare it." That's where the fun began. I spent a whole weekend looking for a suitable site for my mansion. The site had to meet several criteria. First, it had to be big enough for a house and have the ability to connect the utilities. Secondly, it had to be legally clean so that no one could challenge my rights to the plot. And third, and most importantly, it was in a location that Rob and Heather would find completely uninhabitable. I traveled all over Midwest City looking at industrial areas, vacant lots, abandoned lots. The realtor I was working with thought I was kidding at first. "Mr. Harrington, are you sure you're looking for a lot specifically in an industrial area? There are much better places for residential development." "Mr. Davis, I know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a lot in an industrial area with the possibility of a residential building." After 2 days of searching, we found what I was looking for. A 2-acre lot in an east side industrial area, a mile from the city dump and half a mile from a chemical plant. Nearby were warehouses, machine shops, a scrap metal recycling center, and a plastic recycling plant. The air there smelled of machine oil, chemicals, and something vaguely putrid. "Mr. Harrington, you do realize this is a very specific neighborhood here?" Davis wrinkled his nose at the odor coming from the junkyard. "I understand. What's the price?" $50,000 an acre. But frankly, I don't see why you'd want this lot. You could build a warehouse here. Or move the house, I said, not hiding a smile. The lot was perfect, big enough to house my mansion with a small garden. All the utilities were nearby. I could get hooked up without much trouble. And most importantly, it was the last place on earth Rob and Heather would ever want to live. Imagining their faces when they saw their gift in their new surroundings, I couldn't contain my laughter. My gorgeous Victorian mansion amidst the factories and landfills would be a sight they would remember for a lifetime. On Monday, I signed the deed to the property. On Tuesday, I received permission to put a residential building in the industrial zone. Thanks to an acquaintance in the mayor's office, it took only one day instead of the usual weeks. On Wednesday, the engineers started preparing the site, leveling the site, marking the place for the foundation, planning the connection of communications. All this time, I behaved as usual. Went to the store, worked in the garden, took calls from Rob. He kept up his game, asking about my health, inquiring about my business, hinting that I might be working too much in the garden for someone my age. Heather didn't sit idly by either, calling neighbors asking about my condition, continuing to process Dr. Stevens. They thought time was working for them, that every day brought them closer to their goal, that their cunning plan was unfolding according to the script they had laid out. If only they knew that at the same time, on the outskirts of town, workers were preparing the site for their future home. On Thursday, Mark Wilson called me with the good news. Mr. Harrington, we are ready to start work next Monday. The site is prepared, all permits have been obtained, and the crew is available. Are you confident in your decision? Absolutely sure. Good. Then we'll start disconnecting utilities on Sunday and start lifting the house on Monday. After that call, I poured myself a whiskey and stepped out onto the terrace. The sun was setting behind the trees of my garden, coloring the foliage with golden tones. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter in my life and a new chapter in my son's life. He wanted my house. He would have it. True, not quite in the way he expected. Friday morning, I sat in the office of attorney Richard Stone, signing the last of the paperwork. Richard had been working with our family for 15 years, helping me with the sale of the business and the drafting of my will. He was one of the few people I trusted completely, but even he wouldn't explain the true motives for my actions. Michael, are you sure about this decision? Richard took off his glasses and wiped them clean, something he always did when he doubted a client's sanity. The deed of gift of the house to your son is a major step. It will be virtually impossible to undo it. Richard, I know exactly what I'm doing. Rob is my only heir. Sooner or later, the house will go to him anyway. I just decided not to wait for his death. But you'll continue to live in it, won't you? For a while, yes. There's a life tenure clause in the deed. Richard nodded, making final notes on the document. Good. The contract has been drawn up according to your wishes. The house at 123 Willow Heights, with all buildings and appurtenances, passes to your son, Robert Harrington. With the right of lifetime residence for you, I signed the document with a sprawling signature. Technically, my house now belonged to my son. That in a few days this house would end up in an industrial area next to a landfill was a detail Rob would learn later. When do you plan to deliver the deed to your son? Tonight. I want to do it ceremoniously in a family circle. Walking out of the lawyer's office, I felt strangely relieved. The first part of the plan was complete. Now all that was left was to wait until tonight and enjoy my son's reaction to my generous gift. At home, I called Rob at work. Rob, are you free tonight? I'd like to talk to you about an important matter. I could hear the tension in my son's voice. What exactly is it, Dad? I won't talk on the phone. Come over at 7 o'clock, preferably with Heather. It involves both of you. Okay, we will. After lunch, I stood at the library window for a long time, watching the gardener at work. Old Eddie was trimming the hedge, unaware that this was the last time he would work in this garden. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the house would start moving, and this well-maintained plot in an upscale neighborhood would become a wasteland. But today was still the same as before. The sun lit up the familiar alleys. Birds sang in the rose bushes. Neighbors strolled leisurely along the sidewalk. The last quiet day in Willow Heights. By 7 p.m., I was ready for the meeting. I put on my best suit, pulled a bottle of expensive champagne from the bar that I was saving for a special occasion. The deed of gift lay in a leather folder on my office desk, solemn and imposing. Rob and Heather arrived exactly as scheduled. They were clearly nervous, probably thinking I'd somehow found out about their plans. Rob looked guilty. Heather tried to act nonchalant, but there was wariness in her eyes. Come into the study, I said solemnly. I have a surprise for you. We were seated in armchairs by the fireplace. I opened the champagne. The cork popped with a loud pop. making Rob wince. "What are we celebrating?" asked Heather, accepting the glass. "An important family decision," I replied cryptically. "Rob, you're my only son, my only heir, and I've decided that some things aren't worth putting off until later." Rob turned pale. "Dad, what do you mean?" I picked up a folder from the table and held it out solemnly to my son. "Open it." Rob opened the folder with trembling hands and began to read. At first his face expressed bewilderment, then amazement, then incredible joy. "Dad, this is a deed of gift." "Exactly, I'm giving you the house. The whole house with all the outbuildings and appurtenances. You are now officially the owner of this property." Heather snatched the document from her husband's hands and began to study it avidly. Her eyes glistened with delight. "Michael, this is amazing. You're giving us a house." "I'm giving it to Rob," I corrected. "But I suppose as his wife, you'll have something to do with it too." Rob stood up and hugged me. The first time in years, his hug seemed genuine. "Dad, I don't know what to say. That's incredibly generous of you." "Family is family," I replied, savoring the moment. "And a house should belong to young people with their whole lives ahead of them." Heather jumped up to her husband and kissed him on the cheek. "Rob, do you realize what this means? We are now the owners of this beautiful house. We can live here, have guests, have parties." "Of course," I agreed, "although there's a clause in the contract about me living here for life. I hope you don't mind if I stay here for a while longer." "Of course," exclaimed Rob. "It's your house, Dad. You can live here as long as you want." Heather nodded, though a slight disappointment flashed in her eyes. Apparently she had hoped to move in immediately. "What's going to change when I'm on?" she asked. "I mean, technically the house is Rob's now, but in fact everything remains the same." "For now, yes," I answered. "But who knows what the future will bring? Perhaps there will soon be changes that will make your ownership of the house more tangible." Rob studied the contract again, as if he couldn't believe the reality of what was happening. "Dad, why did you make this decision now?" "Why wouldn't I? I'm healthy, in a clear mind, able to make my own decisions. It's better to do it now than to wait for the unknown." Perfect answer. Rob couldn't argue against my capacity without giving away his true plans. "Plus," I continued, "I've been thinking a lot lately about family, about what's really important in life. And I've realized a house is just walls and a roof. It's not where you live that matters. It's who you live with and how you live." Heather broke out into a smile. "Michael, that's so wise and so right. Home is really just a place. It's the people that matter." If only she knew how soon she would have to put those words into practice. "Let's drink to the new owners of the house," I suggested, raising my glass. We clinked glasses. Rob and Heather drank the champagne, not hiding their joy. They looked over at each other, exchanging happy smiles, making plans. "You know, Rob," Heather said, "we could convert the guest room into an office, and we could make the basement a rec room with a big TV. Yeah, and the kitchen could be expanded, combined with the terrace." They were already mentally reorganizing the house to suit their needs. They had forgotten my presence and were planning the future. I silently listened to their dreams and thought about how quickly their mood would change when they saw their new property surrounded by factory pipes. "And the lot is so big," marveled Heather. "We could put in new flower beds, maybe put in a gazebo." "Or a swimming pool," Rob added dreamily. "Great ideas," I agreed. "I'm sure you'll find a great use for this house." They stayed with me until late into the night, discussing plans, thanking me for my generosity, building air castles. When they finally left, I sat in my study for a long time, finishing my champagne. "Tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the morning, the workers will arrive and start to disconnect the communications. In a week, my house will be traveling the roads of Midwest City on special platforms, heading to its new home. And Rob and Heather will get exactly what they asked for. My house. True, in a slightly unexpected package." I got up and walked over to the window. It was quiet and peaceful outside, the last quiet night in Willow Heights. Tomorrow would begin a performance that would be remembered by all involved for years to come. And I was ready to savor every minute of that performance. At 7 o'clock Monday morning, I stood at my bedroom window, watching the first trucks pull up to my house. Mark Wilson arrived punctually, as promised, along with a crew of 8. The trucks were carrying jacks, steel beams, gauges, and a host of other tools I didn't even know the names of. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington." Mark shook my hand. Is your house ready to move in? Ready. Got all the valuables out. Furniture secured as you advised. I'd spent the last few days methodically preparing for this moment. Family photos, documents, a collection of rare books, Jennifer's silverware, all of it was boxed up and sent to storage. Only the most essential furniture and items left in the house that were safe to lose. Great. My guys will disconnect all the utilities first and then we'll start lifting. The whole process will take about a week. The utility workers were the first to arrive. They shut off the gas, electricity, water, and cable TV. The house gradually lost contact with civilization, preparing for the journey. Neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk, watching curiously. Mrs. Collins was the first one who couldn't stand it and approached me. Michael, what's going on? Why are the utilities being shut off? Just some repairs, I answered evasively. Nothing major. But when the workers started putting jacks around the foundation, it became impossible to hide the truth. Mr. Johnson from across the street asked bluntly, Michael, are you moving the house? That's right. To where? To a new place. I didn't go into details, but the news spread instantly through the neighborhood. By noon, a whole crowd of curious people had gathered outside my house. People came to see a sight that most of them had only seen in movies. The process of lifting the house was mesmerizing. Workers placed jacks every 6 feet around the perimeter of the building, then synchronously raised them an inch. Then they would wait a half hour, check for cracks in the walls, and lift another inch. Slowly, methodically, my mansion was being lifted off the ground. By Monday evening, the house was hanging 3 feet in the air. It looked surreal, a Victorian mansion seemingly floating above the foundation. Workers brought steel beams underneath and set up temporary supports. On Tuesday, the climb continued. The house rose another 2 feet. The crowd of gawkers did not diminish. On the contrary, the news of the mansion's transportation spread throughout Midwest City. Reporters were arriving, filming stories for the local news. One reporter even interviewed me briefly. Mr. Harrington, what made you decide to move the house? Personal circumstances, I replied. Sometimes in life, you have to change not only the address, but the house itself. On Wednesday, Rob called. His voice was strange, confused and worried. Dad, Mrs. Collins called me. She says there's some work going on at your house, something with the jacks. What's going on? Oh, that, I replied calmly. Some minor technical work, nothing serious. But she was talking about lifting the house. Rob, don't worry. Everything's under control. You'll see for yourself soon enough. I could hear him talking to someone in the background, probably Heather. Dad, we'd like to come see. You shouldn't yet. There's heavy machinery working around the house. It's not safe. Wait until the weekend. By Thursday, the house had risen to a height of 6 feet. Special wheeled platforms, huge metal structures with dozens of wheels, had been placed under it. The house now stood on these platforms, ready to travel. On Friday morning, the most spectacular thing began, the actual transportation. 2 powerful tractors pulled up to the house. Chains and cables connected the platforms to the trucks. The procession was preparing to depart. Mark Wilson approached me with a walkie-talkie in his hand. Mr. Harrington, everything is ready to go. The route has been coordinated with the police, and the roads are closed. In 4 hours, your house will be in its new location. I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and satisfaction. Begin. The tractor trailers slowly touched down. The house swayed, creaked, but remained intact. The procession moved through Willow Heights with the speed of a pedestrian. Neighbors spilled out into the street, taking pictures, snapping on their phones. Children ran alongside like they were following a circus show. I followed in my car, watching my house slowly float down the city streets. It was an incredible sight, a Victorian mansion on wheels moving majestically among modern buildings. The route was carefully planned. First down the quiet streets of Willow Heights to the main road, then down the highway to the industrial district. Police blocked intersections, stopped traffic, cleared the way for the unusual cargo. People stopped, got out of their cars, pointed fingers. Many people were taking pictures on their phones. It must have been the first time they had ever seen such a sight. I imagined the videos going viral on social media, friends and acquaintances calling Rob and Heather to tell them about the strange procession. 2 hours later, we reached an industrial neighborhood. The landscape had changed dramatically. Instead of neat lawns and flowering trees, there were factory buildings, warehouses, and freight yards. The air became heavier, soaked with the odors of chemicals and machine oil. My plot was located between a plastic recycling plant and a scrap metal recycling center. The workers had already prepared the site, leveled the ground, and installed temporary communications. Everything was ready to place the mansion on the new site. The process of installing the house took another 2 hours. The tractors carefully maneuvered, setting the platforms exactly on the marked place. Then the reverse process began. The house was slowly lowered with jacks until it stood on the new foundation. By late afternoon, it was all finished. My Victorian mansion stood in its new location, surrounded by factory pipes and piles of scrap metal. The picture was surreal, an aristocratic house in the midst of an industrial landscape, like a time-transported artifact. Mark Wilson shook my hand in farewell. "The job is done, Mr. Harrington. We'll hook up the utilities tomorrow, and your house will be fully habitable." "Great job," I praised. "Everything went exactly as I planned." In the evening, I stood on the porch of my house, admiring the new views. Instead of a manicured garden, an industrial landscape now stretched out. Instead of birdsong, there was the hum of factory machinery. Instead of the scent of roses, the smell of chemical industries was in the air. The perfect place to give a gift to an ungrateful son. The phone rang around 9 in the evening. It was Rob calling, and his voice was on the verge of hysteria. "Dad, what have you done? I just got a call from Sandra. She saw it on the news. She says our house has been moved to an industrial area." "Your house," I corrected calmly. "Don't forget, it officially belongs to you now." "But why? Why did you do it? Isn't this what you've been dreaming of? To have my house?" A long pause. Rob was apparently trying to find the words. "Dad, we didn't. That's not what we meant." "Well, what did you mean, son?" Another pause. He could not answer without giving away his true plans. "We'll come tomorrow," he finally said. "Of course, you have the address. I gave you the house along with all the paperwork." After the conversation, I poured myself a whiskey and went out to admire the nightlights of the factories. Tomorrow would be an interesting day. Saturday started with a phone call from architect James Mitchell. I had contacted him back on Thursday when it was obvious that the transportation would be a success. Mitchell was famous for his luxury home designs and was willing to take on a rush order for the appropriate fee. "Mr. Harrington, I inspected your lot last night. It's a great location. Level ground, all utilities close by, excellent orientation to the sides of the world. When would you like to begin construction?" "As soon as possible. Money isn't a problem. It's quality and speed that counts." "I see. My guys can start the preparatory work on Monday. We'll lay the foundation next week and start the frame in 2 weeks." The new house was to surpass the old one in every way. 3 floors instead of 2, 7 bedrooms instead of 5, a home theater, a wine cellar, a gym, a library with a fireplace and panoramic windows. The architect suggested a modern style with elements of the classics: glass, steel, and natural stone instead of Victorian carvings. "Budget?" inquired Mitchell. "1.5 million. You can add whatever you think you need for a house of this caliber." At 10 in the morning, I was already standing on my vacated lot in Willow Heights, watching surveyors mark out the site for the foundation. The spot where my old house had stood for 30 years was now a flat area, with utility lines sticking out of the ground. The neighbors peered curiously over the fence, trying to figure out what was going to happen next. Mrs. Collins was the first to speak up. "Michael, are you building a new house?" "That's right. Decided the old one had served its time." "But why move it? You could have just torn it down." "I had my reasons for keeping it," I replied cryptically. By noon, a whole construction crew was working on the site. They were leveling the site, digging trenches for the foundation, setting the formwork. The work was boiling. Mitchell wasn't kidding when he promised a quick realization of the project. At 1 o'clock, I saw a familiar silver car driving slowly down the street. Rob and Heather had come to see what was left of their dream. The car stopped in front of the lot, but they didn't get out. They just sat there looking at the construction site. Finally, Rob got out and walked over to me. His face was pale and his eyes read confusion and hurt. "Dad, what does this mean?" "Building a new house. Isn't it obvious?" But you gave us the old house." So, that doesn't mean I can't build myself a new one. Heather got out of the car as well. She was wearing an expensive dress and high heels, clearly not the best choice for a visit to a construction site. She stared in horror at the activity simmering around her. Michael, you can't build a new house here. We were going to live in the old one. Heather, dear, the old house belongs to Rob now. You can live in it whenever you want. But it's in an industrial neighborhood now. Yes, can you imagine the convenience of not having to drive far to work if you want to get a job in a factory? Rob clenched his fists. Dad, stop mocking me. Explain why you did this. I set aside the blueprints I'd been studying with the foreman and looked at my son carefully. Rob, you got exactly what you wanted. My house is yours now. Isn't this what you've been dreaming of? It's not. We wanted... He paused, realizing he'd almost given himself away. What did you want? A long pause. Heather nudged her husband with her elbow, hinting that something needed to be said, but Rob remained silent. We wanted you to stay living in the old house, Heather finally said. And now it turns out you're building a new one, and we have to go to the industrial zone. No one's forcing you to go there. You can live wherever you want. I gave the house to you out of fatherly love. After noon, the three of us went to see the gift in its new location. The drive to the industrial district took 40 minutes. We had to drive across town. Heather was silent the whole way, staring out the window with a look of deep disappointment on her face. When we arrived at the site, their reactions exceeded my expectations. Heather let out something resembling a groan of despair. Rob just stood there with his mouth open, unable to believe what he was seeing. My former mansion looked like the set of an anti-utopia movie. The elegant Victorian architecture seemed incongruous amidst the factory buildings and piles of scrap metal. The aristocratic carved details contrasted with the rusty pipes and concrete walls of the surrounding buildings. Oh my God, Heather whispered. What have you done? It's beautiful, isn't it? Said I cheerfully. You won't see this combination of styles anywhere else. We stepped closer. The house stood on a temporary foundation, utilities not yet connected. There were construction materials, tools, and pieces of concrete lying around. There was a picturesque view of a chemical plant on one side and a scrap metal dump on the other. Dad, Rob's voice shook with restrained rage. This is impossible. You can't live here. Why can't it be? The house is the same, only the location is different. But it stinks here. It's noisy. It's dangerous. Rob, don't be so picky. Lots of people live in much worse conditions and don't complain. Heather walked around the house in circles, peering in the windows, assessing the damage. Most of the furniture was still in place, but everything was covered in construction dust. The garden I'd spent years creating had turned into a trampled lot. Michael, she turned to me with a face contorted with anger. You did this on purpose. You knew we wanted to live in that house. Heather, dear, don't be silly. How could I have known about your plans? It's not like you told me anything. She opened her mouth to object, but Rob grabbed her arm. Heather, don't. They realized they were walking into a trap. Any complaints about my actions would give away their true motives. They couldn't bluntly say they expected to get a house in an upscale neighborhood without confessing their self-serving plans. By the way, Moss added, you'll need to hook up utilities. Electricity, gas, water. That could take a few weeks and cost $10,000. $10,000? Gasped Heather. Well, maybe 15. The rates are higher in the industrial area. Rob sat down on the porch steps and covered his face with his hands. Dad, why? Just tell me, why did you do it? I sat down next to him on the steps of our family home, which was now surrounded by factory chimneys instead of flowering gardens. Rob, in life sometimes the unexpected happens. What seems like a gift can turn out to be a challenge. What looks like good luck can be a lesson. What lesson? A lesson about being careful what you wish for, because they can come true. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Heather walked around the house, taking pictures of the sights, the mountains of trash, the rusty pipes, the chemical sweat on the walls of the neighboring buildings. What about the new house? Asked Rob finally. What? What? You're building a new house on our old place. What will happen when it's ready? I'll live in it, of course. What else? And us? Why, you. You have a house of your own. True, in a somewhat unusual place, but a home nonetheless. Rob stood up and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before, a mixture of hatred, despair, and realization of his own powerlessness. You knew everything, didn't you? You knew about our plans? I didn't deny it. I did. And you decided to teach us a lesson, decided to give you what you wanted. Heather walked over to us, holding her cell phone. Rob, we need to go. It's impossible to be here. The smell is making us sick. They got into the car and drove off without saying goodbye. I was left alone beside my present, admiring the way the evening sun lit up the Victorian turrets against the factory chimneys. By late afternoon, I returned to Willow Heights, where the construction site was already in full swing. Workers were installing floodlights for nighttime work. Mitchell wasn't kidding about the deadline. The foreman came up to me with a report. Mr. Harrington, the foundation will be ready by Wednesday. We'll start framing on Friday. If the weather holds, you'll have a roof by the end of the month. That's great news. Work hard and spare no expense. In the evening, I sat in my temporary home, a rented apartment in the center of town, and planned the next steps. The first act of the play had been completed successfully. Rob and Heather had learned a lesson they would remember for a long time. But that was only the beginning. There were many more surprises ahead of them with the ownership of the property in the industrial area. The construction of the new house took exactly 3 months. James Mitchell kept his promise. His crew worked like clockwork despite the fall rains and the first frost. Every day I came to the construction site, watching my new mansion grow. First, they poured a foundation of reinforced concrete, twice as strong as the old house. Then they erected a frame of steel beams. By the end of October, the roof was ready. In November, we finished the exterior finishing, and in December, we started the interior work. The new house exceeded all my expectations. 3 floors of elegant modern architecture, floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, marble floors in the lobby, oak paneling in the library. The kitchen was equipped with the latest generation of appliances. The wine cellar held 500 bottles. The home theater had a sound like a real theater. The master bedroom on the second floor had its own terrace overlooking the garden and the guest house, which I planned to use as a workshop. I especially loved the new library, a spacious room with high ceilings and built-in mahogany bookcases. The huge windows faced east, so the room was filled with soft sunlight in the morning. In the corner stood an antique globe I'd managed to salvage from the old house, and by the window sat Jennifer's rocking chair, the only thing I'd taken from a past life for sentimental reasons. The neighbors watched the construction with ill-concealed envy. The house turned out to be 1.5 times the size of any other in the neighborhood, and its cost was clearly in excess of $2 million. Mrs. Collins once remarked that the new house was too pompous for our quiet neighborhood, to which I replied that everyone was free to spend their money as they saw fit. Mr. Johnson wondered if I planned to have loud parties, hinting at a home theater. I assured him that I appreciated the quiet as much as he did. During those 3 months, Rob called me regularly. For the first few weeks, he called every day, trying to convince me to fix the mistake and put the house back where it was. He talked about some technical difficulties in moving it back, about neighbors in the industrial zone complaining about the inappropriateness of a residential house in the midst of factories. I patiently explained that the technical possibility of transportation back existed, but that I had no desire to do so. Dad, that's absurd, he insisted during one such conversation. A Victorian house in the middle of chemical plants. It's a mockery of architecture. Rob, isn't it a mockery to send a healthy man to a nursing home for the sake of seizing his property? He fell silent, realizing he was walking into a trap. Then he started offering to buy a new plot of land from me to build his house there. He promised to pay the market price, even more than the market price. I replied that the plot was not for sale for any money. Then he asked me to help with the sale of the mansion in the industrial zone, to find a buyer, to organize the deal, at least to give advice. Dad, Heather, and I have been studying the market, he reported in an October conversation. Similar houses in the industrial zone aren't selling at all. Realtors are refusing to take such properties. Maybe we should lower the price. To how much? We're willing to sell for 1/3 of the original price, but even at that price, no one wants to buy a house next to a landfill. Then live in it yourself. Dad, you know that's impossible. Why not? The house is the same. The amenities are the same. But the smell, the noise, the dirt. Rob, lots of people live in far worse conditions and don't complain. Every such conversation ended with Rob hanging up the phone and me going back to watching construction. Heather, meanwhile, had fallen into a real depression. According to Rob, she stopped leaving the house, didn't socialize with her friends, didn't want to discuss plans for the future. The dream of living in a luxurious mansion collapsed so painfully that the woman could not accept it. She blamed everything on her husband. She said that any normal man would have been able to negotiate with his father, that Rob was too weak and characterless to defend the interests of the family. She says you humiliated us on purpose, Rob relayed, that it was a planned revenge, thought out to the last detail. And what do you say to her? That I don't know, that you couldn't have known about our plans. But we both knew he was lying. Rob knew perfectly well that I'd heard everything and understood everything. It was just easier for him to pretend there was a misunderstanding that could be fixed. In November, Heather began demanding drastic action from Rob. She suggested that he go to a lawyer, sue his father for moral damages, and try to contest the gift agreement. Rob told me about it with doom in his voice. He understood the hopelessness of any legal action, but he couldn't explain it to his wife without confessing the true motives behind their plans. Dad, Heather wants us to hire private investigator, he informed me one day in late November. She thinks you have some ulterior motives, that you're not acting on your own. What kind of ulterior motives? She thinks someone put you up to it, or that you're getting revenge on us for something specific. Rob, tell your wife that my motives are very simple. I'm giving my son the house he wanted to get. By the end of November, the relationship between Rob and Heather had become critical. He stopped telling me the details of their family quarrels, but it was clear from his tired voice that all hell was breaking loose at home. Heather couldn't accept the collapse of her plans and took her anger out on her husband, accusing him of all the deadly sins. Dad, Heather has filed for divorce, he announced in early December. His voice was hollow, unemotional. She says she can't be married to a loser who couldn't even get a proper inheritance from her father. I'm sorry to hear that. You're sorry? You set this whole thing up on purpose. Rob, I didn't force anyone to plan my confinement in a nursing home. A long pause. Her son's heavy breathing could be heard in the receiver. You knew. I knew. And you decided to get revenge. I decided to teach him a lesson. What lesson, Dad? That I'm a bad son? That I didn't deserve your love? A lesson that betrayal has a price, that you can't build happiness on someone else's misfortune. But we didn't mean you any harm. We were thinking of a good nursing home, medical care. Rob, stop lying. You knew perfectly well that I was healthy and didn't need any care. You planned to get rid of me for the house. He didn't disagree. Yes, I was planning to. And now what? Are you happy? I got what I wanted, peace of mind and the right to control my own life. And I lost my wife. You lost a wife who used you for her own ends. That's not a loss, it's a liberation. After that conversation, Rob didn't call for 3 weeks. I threw a housewarming party on December 23rd. I invited the few remaining friends, the neighbors, the architect, and his construction crew. The house shone in all its glory. Every detail was thought out and executed flawlessly. Parquet floors made of stained oak, stucco on the ceilings, stained glass in the hall, marble fireplaces in the living room and library. The kitchen was equipped with professional appliances. In the wine cellar, there were already the first cases with collectible wines. In the home theater, you could watch movies with the comfort of a real theater. Guests walked through the rooms with admiration, praising the taste and scope. Dr. Stevens took a long look at the home gymnasium, equipped with the latest technology. Architect Mitchell accepted congratulations like the director of a successful play. Neighbors regarded the master bedroom with a walk-in closet the size of a small apartment with envy. Michael, this is just amazing, Dr. Stevens' wife was saying. How did you decide to tear down an old house and build such a masterpiece? Sometimes you have to part with the past to build the future, I replied philosophically. But after all, the old house was beautiful too. The old house served its time. Now it's time for a new one. Rob didn't show up for the housewarming party. I didn't invite him, but I didn't forbid him to come. He'd made his choice, and I respected his decision to stay away. The guests dispersed late in the afternoon, leaving me alone in my new home. I strolled through the empty rooms, savoring the silence and spaciousness. Everything was exactly as I'd imagined. Every detail reflected my taste, my needs, my personality. No one imposed their opinion on me about where I should live or how I should organize my life. On the 1st of January, as I sat in the new library with a glass of champagne, enjoying the view of the snow-covered garden, the phone rang. It was Rob calling, and his voice was strange, tired and kind of downcast. "Dad, Happy New Year." "Happy New Year to you too, son." Heather finally left, took all her stuff and went back to her mother's. I sympathize. No, you don't. It's what you wanted. I stayed silent, sipping my champagne and looking at the snow falling outside the window. "Dad, I realized you heard everything back then, in the living room, when my mother-in-law and Heather and I were planning to put you in a nursing home." "Got it. And you decided to get back at us. Decided to give you what you wanted. You wanted my house. You got it. You wanted to get rid of me. You got rid of me. But we're family." "Family?" I grinned. "Rob, family is when people take care of each other, not plan how to rob an elderly relative." "We weren't going to rob you." "Well, what were you going to do? Provide me with a wonderful old age surrounded by a caring nursing home staff?" He didn't answer, but I could hear his heavy breathing. "Rob, you're a grown man. You had the opportunity to choose between your father and your greedy wife. You chose." "Yeah, I thought we were acting in your best interest." "No, you knew you were acting in your best interest. You just hoped I wouldn't find out." "Dad, but you could have talked to me. Explained that you knew what our plans were. We would have talked things over. Found a compromise." "What compromise, Rob?" "You'd stay in my house and send me to a simpler place?" "I would have. I don't know what I'd do. But we could talk as a family." Families don't plot against each other in secret. Families don't discuss the incapacitation of healthy relatives with doctors. After that conversation, there were 2 more weeks of silence. I was settling into my new home, enjoying the comfort and peace. Life became calmer and more pleasant. No one plotted against me. No one discussed my incapacity with doctors and neighbors. I read books in the new library, cooked meals in the modern kitchen, watched movies in the home theater. Loneliness no longer weighed on me. It had become synonymous with freedom. On January 15th, what I expected to happen, happened. Rob tried to force his way in. He arrived at my new house around 9 p.m. and started ringing the intercom, demanding that I open the door. I saw him through the CCTV camera, disheveled, agitated, clearly drunk. When I didn't answer the intercom, he started making phone calls. In one evening, he made 87 calls. I sat in my office reading a biography of Roosevelt and listening to the phone ring. After the first 10 rings, I turned the sound off, but I could see the screen blinking. Rob would call every 2 or 3 minutes, clearly hoping I wouldn't hold out and answer. In between calls, he would hit the intercom button, yelling something into the camera, waving his arms. Around midnight, he apparently realized the futility of his attempts, got in his car and drove away. I checked the surveillance footage. For the last half an hour, he just stood at the gate and cried. The next day he came again, but sober and calm. He stood at the gate for 2 hours, occasionally pressing the intercom button. I watched him from the library window. My son looked haggard, aged, lost. His divorce from Heather had obviously been hard on him. He'd lost weight. He'd gotten gaunt. His movements had a kind of doom in them. But I wasn't going to pity him. Pity would be a betrayal of himself. Rob had made his choice when he planned to put me in a nursing home. He chose material goods over family love, self-interest over decency. By evening, Rob realized I wouldn't open the door, got in his car and drove away. He never showed up again. A week passed, then another. The phone was silent. Rob finally realized that the bridge between us was finally burned. In February, I got a letter from a lawyer. Rob had sold the mansion in the industrial zone to a company that planned to convert it into offices. The price was ridiculous, $50,000 for a house that once cost $1 million. But even for that money, the buyer was not found immediately. The deal took 3 months. I sat in my new office, admiring the view of the snow-covered garden, and thought about how strange life is. A year ago, I had a son, a daughter-in-law, the tradition of Sunday dinners, the illusion of family warmth. Now I had a beautiful home, peace, independence, and the bitter knowledge of what family ties are worth when it comes to big money. Was I sorry for what had happened? No. Rob had made his choice long before the day I overheard them talking. He chose between his father and his wife, between conscience and self-interest, between honesty and betrayal. He got exactly what he wanted, my house, but in a somewhat unexpected package. And I got what I deserved, peace, dignity, and the right to control my own life without regard for other people's plans for my future. Outside, snow was falling, covering my new garden with a white blanket. Tomorrow I would begin planning for spring planting. I had a new life ahead of me in my new home, free of illusions of family warmth and filial love. And it was a good life. Honest, peaceful, dignified,